I heard my name spoken like a problem that needed to be solved before lunch. Not a person, not a father, not even an inconvenience that deserved respect, just a decision. From the hallway, I stood still with a glass of water in my hand, watching my own family treat the house like I had already left it. "My father won't agree easily," my eldest son Min said. His voice was calm, rehearsed. "But it doesn't matter, we've delayed this long enough." There was a pause after that, the kind of pause where everyone waits for someone else to feel guilty first. No one did. Then my daughter-in-law spoke, soft, careful, like she was discussing furniture placement, not a living man. "He's been alone for too long. It's not safe anymore. The nursing arrangement is the most reasonable option." Safe. That word lingered in the air like something poisoned, but politely served. I didn't move. I had learned, over 20 years, that movement too early changes nothing. Silence, however, changes everything, if you know how to use it. From where I stood, I could see the dining table. My dining table. The same table I had bought with overtime wages when Min was still learning to walk. The surface had a faint scratch near the edge, left by a metal toy truck he once dragged across it when he was 6. Now that same table held papers, stacks of them, and on top a folder with my name written in neat black ink. Not my handwriting. Someone else had already begun rewriting me. The old wristwatch lay beside the folder, the same watch I stopped wearing the day my wife died. 3:17 frozen in time. A moment I never fixed because some moments are not meant to move forward. My granddaughter ran past the hallway, laughing. She stopped when she saw me, then hesitated like she wasn't sure whether I belonged in the same version of the house as the adults. "Grandpa," she said quickly, then ran off again. The word felt smaller than it used to. Inside the room, Min continued. "We just need clarity," he said. "The accounts, the property, the medical authority. Once everything is centralized, it'll be easier for everyone." Everyone. Not me. I finally took a step forward. No one noticed at first. That's the thing about families who have already decided you are fading. You can still stand right in front of them and remain invisible. I placed the glass of water on the counter. The sound made them turn. Silence hit the room differently now. Not peaceful silence. Measuring silence. Min looked at me first. His eyes flickered, just for a second, like someone adjusting to lighting they weren't expecting. "Dad," he said, too quickly. "We were just discussing practical arrangements." Practical. I nodded once. I always nod. It's a habit people mistake for agreement. My gaze drifted to the documents: power of attorney, medical delegation, asset consolidation. My name repeated across every page, like a signature that no longer belonged to me. I picked up the top sheet. No shaking hands, no anger, no reaction they could use to define me, just reading. The daughter-in-law shifted slightly. "It's for your own comfort," she added. "We just want to reduce your burden." Burden. That word is always chosen carefully in families like mine. It sounds compassionate while it quietly removes your existence. I set the paper down. "You've been planning this for how long?" I asked. My voice surprised them. Not loud, not sharp, just final in a way they didn't expect. Min hesitated. That hesitation told me more than any answer could. My younger son, Tuan, spoke instead. "It's not like that. We were going to talk to you. We just needed everything organized first." Organized? I almost smiled. They always think control looks like organization. They never realize it also looks like preparation. I walked slowly to the chair at the head of the table. The chair I had stopped sitting in recently because no one ever looked at it anymore unless they needed something signed. I sat down. The wood creaked under me. That sound reminded me of something older than the house. Something inside me shifting back into place after years of being ignored. "I've lived in this house for 40 years, I said quietly. No one interrupted. That was new. "And in those 40 years, I continued, I have signed every loan you ever needed, paid every debt you never told your wives about. covered every mistake you thought I didn't notice. Min's jaw tightened slightly. I saw it. I always saw it. Children rarely notice a father disappearing until the things he paid for start disappearing with him. I tapped the folder once. "Do you know what this is?" I asked. No one answered, so I answered for them. It's a version of my life where I no longer exist, except as a signature. The room shifted again, not physically, emotionally. Like air pressure changing before a storm arrives. I leaned back slightly. "You made one mistake," I said. Tuan frowned. "What mistake?" I looked at him for a long time. "You assumed I didn't notice when I stopped being needed." That was the moment the silence changed, because they realized something they hadn't prepared for. I hadn't been declining. I had been observing. For 20 years, every request, every conversation, every assumption made about me when I wasn't in the room, every time my name became shorthand for someone who will handle it. I remembered all of it, and I said nothing. Because silence, when used correctly, doesn't mean absence, it means storage. I stood up again, slowly. The wristwatch on the table caught the light, still frozen at 3:17, still refusing to move like the rest of them had. "I will not sign anything today," I said. Min's voice softened. "Dad, this isn't about control." I raised a hand slightly, not anger, not authority, finality. "It never is," I said. I turned toward the hallway, but before I left the room, I noticed something that made me pause. A second folder, half hidden under the tablecloth. Different color, older paper. My name again. But this one wasn't about care, it was about transfer, complete transfer. Signed already. My signature, my exact signature, dated 2 weeks ago. I stared at it longer than I intended. Behind me, no one spoke. And in that moment, I understood something that settled deeper than anger ever could. Someone had already begun removing me from my own life, and I hadn't been the one holding the pen. The second folder didn't leave my mind, even after I closed the door behind me and stepped into the quiet of the hallway. Quiet is never really quiet in a house like mine. It carries memory. Every step I took back toward the living room felt heavier than the last, not because my body was weak, but because something inside the structure of my life had shifted without warning. I sat in my worn recliner, the same recliner my wife used to sit beside when she was still alive, reading letters from our children before they even learned how to write properly. The old wristwatch was still on the table. 3:17. Frozen, like a witness that refused to testify. I picked it up without thinking. The glass was slightly scratched now, more than I remembered. Time does that, not just to objects, but to meaning. It slowly erases the sharpness of memory until even grief becomes familiar furniture in the room. From the hallway, I could still hear faint movement. They hadn't left. That told me everything. If a family continues speaking after you've left the room, it means you are no longer part of the conversation. You are the subject of it. I closed my eyes, and I remembered the first time I signed something for Min. He was 22, a failed business, a debt he swore he could manage. His voice cracked when he asked me, not because he was ashamed, but because he already knew I would say yes. "I just need a guarantor, Dad." That was the beginning, not of helping, but of expectation. Because once you become the solution, you stop being a person, you become infrastructure. And infrastructure is never thanked, only used. The sound of footsteps pulled me back. Lan, my sister-in-law, she entered the living room without hesitation, carrying a tray I hadn't asked for. Tea, again, always tea, as if warmth could replace honesty. "You didn't eat much earlier," she said softly. I looked at her. She didn't avoid my gaze. That was her strength. People who intend to replace you rarely avoid eye contact. They want you to see how calm they are about it. "I ate enough," I replied. She nodded, placing the tray beside me. Then she sat, not across from me but slightly to the side, a position that is neither guest nor authority, but something in between, a bridge. "I heard what they were discussing," she said after a moment. I didn't respond. She continued anyway. "They're worried about you living alone. Min thinks it's not sustainable anymore. Sustainable. Another word that sounds reasonable when you want to remove someone quietly. I set the watch down. "Did you sign anything?" I asked. She paused, just for a fraction of a second. That pause told me she understood exactly what I meant. "No," she said, but she didn't sound surprised that I asked, which meant she already knew I had seen it. I leaned forward slightly. "Where did that document come from?" Lon folded her hands carefully. "I think you already know," she said. No accusation, no emotion, just confirmation. That was worse, because confirmation removes uncertainty, but replaces it with something heavier: truth. I stared at her. For years, she had been the quiet center of the household, the person everyone trusted because she never demanded trust. She simply occupied it until no one remembered when it began. "I didn't sign anything 2 weeks ago," I said. She nodded slowly. "I know." The room grew still. Even the clock in the kitchen seemed louder now, as if it had been waiting for permission to continue. I felt something tighten inside my chest, not panic, but recognition. This wasn't confusion, it was design. Someone had placed my life into a structure I didn't build, and I had been walking inside it for years without noticing the walls. "You've been helping them," I said quietly. It wasn't a question. Lon didn't deny it. "I've been trying to stabilize things," she said. "You've been overwhelmed for a long time. They just needed direction." Direction. I let that word sit between us. Because direction is what people give when they believe you are no longer capable of choosing your own path. "You think I'm incapable," I said. Still, no anger, only observation. Lan finally looked down at her hands. "No," she said. "I think they don't know how to function without structure." "And you think I am the structure?" She didn't answer immediately. That hesitation again, the same hesitation from earlier, and then, "Yes." One word: clean. Honest in a way that didn't ask for forgiveness. I leaned back in the recliner. Something inside me settled, not in peace, but in alignment. Like a machine finally understanding what it had been reduced to. Structure. That's what they had always mistaken me for. Not a man, not a father, not a husband who once held a dying woman's hand through sleepless nights. Just structure. Useful until replaced. "Do you know what happens," I said quietly, "when you remove a foundation from a house that looks stable?" Lan's eyes lifted slightly. "No," she said. I nodded once. "It doesn't fall immediately," I said. "It adjusts, it compensates, it convinces itself nothing has changed." A pause. "Until it does." For the first time, something flickered in her expression. Not fear, understanding. I stood up, slowly. The wristwatch slipped slightly in my hand before I placed it back on the table. "I want to see all financial accounts," I said. Lan didn't move. "That's not necessary," she replied gently. "I didn't ask if it was necessary," I said. "I said I want to see them." Silence stretched. Then she stood, not resisting, not agreeing, just acknowledging a shift. As she walked toward the hallway, I noticed something I hadn't before. Her movements were precise, not nervous, not hesitant, practiced. Like someone who had already rehearsed what would happen if I eventually stopped being quiet. And that realization settled deeper than any betrayal I had experienced before. Because betrayal is expected from enemies, but preparation from family. That changes the shape of everything. As she reached the doorway, she paused. Without turning back, she said softly, "You should be careful, Uncle." Uncle, not father, not even by name, just distance, formalized. Then she added one more sentence, calm, measured, almost gentle. "The signature on that document wasn't the only thing they've already decided without you." And she walked out of the room, leaving me alone with a frozen watch and the realization that what I thought was my life had already been quietly rewritten while I was still living inside it. The house felt different after she left the room, as if her absence had confirmed something I hadn't yet admitted to myself. Not emptiness, structure revealing itself. I stood for a long time in front of the table where the wristwatch lay. 3:17, still unchanged, still refusing to participate in the illusion of progress. That number used to mean the exact moment my wife stopped breathing. Now it felt like something else. A warning that time doesn't heal anything. It only teaches people how to walk around what they've broken. From the hallway, I heard soft voices again. Not arguing, not debating. Planning, but carefully. The kind of planning people do when they believe the subject of their plan cannot hear them anymore. I didn't move. I had spent 20 years learning how to remain still while the world rearranged itself around me. Stillness is not weakness when it is chosen. It becomes observation, and observation always comes before understanding. I walked slowly to the cabinet beneath the living room shelf. Inside, hidden behind old documents and unused photo albums, was a small metal box. No one in the house had ever opened it except me, not because it was locked, but because I never allowed it to be part of the shared narrative of this family. I placed it on the table. The sound it made was quiet, but final. Inside were papers, not emotional things, not memories, not letters, records, bank transfers spanning decades, property deeds, loan guarantees, names repeated over and over again, Min, Tuan. Even accounts linked indirectly through spouses I had never fully trusted but always tolerated. Each document had one common signature, mine, or at least the version of it I had used when I still believed that saving people meant they would eventually stand on their own. I ran my thumb across one of the pages. The ink had slightly faded, but the intention hadn't. That was the problem with responsibility. It doesn't disappear when you stop carrying it. It just waits for someone else to notice it was never theirs to begin with. A sound behind me. Footsteps. This time, heavier. Min. He stopped when he saw the box. He didn't ask what it was. That told me he already knew. "You've been going through things," he said carefully. I didn't look at him yet. "I've been remembering," I corrected. A pause. Then he stepped closer. "Dad, Lon said you were upset earlier. We didn't mean to overwhelm you with paperwork. We were just trying to prepare things properly." Prepare. That word again. Always used when someone else is being removed from their own decisions. I finally turned. He looked older than I remembered him in this light. Not physically. Something else. Something subtle. The kind of aging that happens when a person starts believing they are the most reasonable voice in every room they enter. "I want to ask you something," I said. He hesitated. "Of course." I lifted one of the documents. "This account," I said. "The one under my name, but managed by you. When did you start transferring from it?" His face tightened slightly. Not guilt. Calculation. That was the first truth. He wasn't trying to deny it. He was trying to measure how much I already knew. "It wasn't like that," he said finally. "It was temporary. You agreed when things were difficult." Temporary is the most permanent lie families tell each other. I nodded slowly. "So you admit it." He exhaled sharply. "It's not stealing, Dad. It was managing. You weren't keeping track properly anymore." There it was, the shift. Not accusation, reclassification. First they take your resources, then they redefine your awareness, then they call it care. I placed the paper back down. "How much?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. That silence told me enough. More than I expected, more than I wanted. Finally, he said, "It doesn't matter anymore. Everything is organized now. That's what matters." Organized. I almost smiled again. They kept using that word like it was salvation. But organization is only comforting when you are the one deciding what gets erased. I walked past him toward the window. Outside, the street looked unchanged. Neighbors still watering plants. A motorbike passing slowly. Life continuing in its usual ignorance. But inside this house, something irreversible had already shifted. "You said earlier I shouldn't be living alone," I said. "Yes," he replied quickly. "That's still true." I nodded. And who decided that? He frowned. We all did, together. Together. I turned back toward him. No, I said quietly. You decided what kind of life I should have after removing what I built mine on. His expression changed slightly, a flicker of frustration now. You're being unfair, he said. Unfair. Another word people use when consequences stop aligning with their expectations. I walked back toward the table. Each step slower than the last, not because I was weak, but because I wanted him to feel the weight of each second. I spent 20 years, I said, making sure none of you ever felt the consequences of your decisions. Min shifted slightly. I paid debts you didn't tell your wives about. I signed guarantees you didn't understand. I fixed mistakes before they became problems you had to face. My voice stayed calm. That was important, because calm is what makes truth unbearable. And you thought that was normal, I continued, because I never asked for it back. Silence again. Different this time. Thicker. He looked away, not at me, at the table, at the documents, at something he couldn't reframe quickly enough. That was the first crack. I opened the metal box again and pulled out one final folder. This one was different. Not financial, not legal. Personal records. Emails printed out. Messages. Notes I had kept but never responded to. Patterns. Years of patterns. Every time I was excluded from decisions about my own life. Every time my opinion was discussed without me. Every time my presence was reduced to logistics. Min saw it and froze slightly. What is that? He asked. I held it gently. This, I said, is what you forgot I was doing while you were deciding I wasn't necessary anymore. His voice lowered. You've been keeping track of everything? I looked at him. For the first time in a long while, I didn't soften my expression. I've been silent for 20 years, I said. A pause. And silence is not emptiness. It is recording. The room felt smaller now. Not physically, relationally. As if the distance between us had collapsed into something too tight to ignore. Then I added, quietly, You didn't take over my life when I wasn't looking. I placed the folder down. You took it while assuming I had stopped watching. Min didn't speak. And in that silence, I saw something I had been waiting to see for a long time. Not fear, recognition. Because somewhere, beneath everything he believed about control, he understood the simplest truth forming in front of him. I had not been removed. I had been preparing. And whatever they thought they had finalized was only the beginning of something they had not yet been allowed to understand. The hallway light flickered once behind him, and I realized something else. The house wasn't waiting for me to agree anymore. It was waiting for me to decide what I would take back first. The house didn't feel like it was mine anymore. That thought didn't arrive as panic. It arrived as observation, cold, precise, almost clinical. I stood in front of the dining table long after Min stopped speaking, long after his footsteps faded down the hallway. The folder I had placed down remained exactly where it was, as if even touching it again would acknowledge something irreversible had already been agreed upon without me. Outside, rain began tapping softly against the window. Not hard enough to demand attention, just consistent enough to be remembered. I sat down. The worn recliner creaked beneath me, familiar but no longer comforting. It was strange how objects outlive emotions. The chair remembered me better than my own children did. I looked at the wristwatch again. 3:17. Always 3:17. My wife used to say I should fix it. I never did. Not because I couldn't, but because I refused to let that moment become something adjustable. Now I realized something uncomfortable. They had been adjusting everything else instead. From the hallway, I heard faint movement again. Not urgency, not confrontation, just the quiet rhythm of people who believe they still have time to finish rewriting a story. I closed my eyes briefly. And I remembered something I hadn't thought about in years. The first loan I ever signed for Min wasn't large. It was emotional. That was the real debt. He had looked at me that day like I was not just a father, but a safety net that could never break. I had mistaken that look for trust, but it wasn't trust, it was expectation forming its shape. The kind that never disappears once it settles. The door opened again, Lan returned, this time without a tray, without tea, without performance. She stood near the entrance of the living room, not fully inside, not fully outside, a threshold presence. "I saw the documents," she said. I didn't respond immediately, because I had begun to understand something about Lan. She never entered conversations without already knowing their outcome. "You've been managing them," I said finally. A slight pause. "I've been stabilizing what you refused to confront," she replied. Refused, not failed, not overlooked, refused. That word carried judgment, disguised as logic. I nodded slowly. "And you decided I needed to be removed from that equation." Her expression didn't change. "I decided you needed rest," she said. Rest. Another soft word used to describe exclusion. I looked at her more carefully now, not as family, not as ally, but as structure, adjacent to structure. "I want to know something," I said. She waited. "Who initiated the transfer?" A silence followed, this one different, heavier. Not hesitation from ignorance, hesitation from choice. Finally, she stepped fully into the room, and for the first time, she looked tired, not physically, morally. "It started before I intervened," she said quietly. That answer changed the air in the room. Before I intervened, not before I noticed, not before I reacted, before I intervened. Which meant she was not the origin, only the continuation. I leaned forward slightly. "Explain." Lan exhaled slowly. "They began preparing this years ago," she said. "At first it was small adjustments, shared access, minor financial delegation, things you approved without reading closely." I remembered. I always signed quickly when they said it was urgent, because urgency is how families train trust to stop asking questions. She continued. "Then it became routine, and once something becomes routine, it stops being questioned." I stared at the table, at the grain of wood I had seen 1,000 times but never truly examined. "And the signature?" I asked. Lan hesitated again. That hesitation told me she was now stepping into something she hadn't fully controlled either. "They replicated it," she said. The words landed differently than I expected. Not dramatic, not explosive, just final in a way that didn't need repetition. Replicated, not forged in panic, not stolen in haste. Replicated, meaning someone had studied me long enough to become me on paper. I let the silence stretch. Outside, rain intensified slightly. I could hear it now fully against the glass, like time pressing harder against something that refused to yield. "And you allowed this to continue?" I asked. Her eyes lowered briefly. "I contained it," she said. "If I had exposed it earlier, everything would have collapsed sooner." "Everything," I repeated. She nodded. "The family, the assets, the stability they rely on." I leaned back. For a long moment, I said nothing. Because there is a difference between betrayal and management of betrayal. One breaks trust, the other uses it. I finally spoke. "So I was never being protected," I said quietly. "I was being contained." Lan didn't deny it. That was her honesty, her flaw, or perhaps her strength. "I was trying to prevent collapse," she said. "And what do you think I am?" I asked. She looked at me then, properly, for the first time, not as someone fading, but as someone still present. "You are the reason it hasn't already collapsed," she said. The words should have felt like recognition, but they didn't. They felt like confirmation of something heavier, not importance, dependency. There is a cruel difference. I stood up slowly. The room didn't react. It never does when a foundation moves. It only reacts when something above it starts to fall. "I want access restored," I said. Lan shook her head slightly. "That's not possible right now." "Not possible," I repeated. "No," she said. "Not without alerting them. And if they are alerted? She hesitated again, then answered honestly. Then everything unravels at once. I walked toward the window, rain now fully visible, thicker, uninterrupted. The street outside looked the same, but I knew better now. Things rarely change visibly at the beginning, only structurally. I spoke without turning. How long? I asked. Lon didn't ask what I meant. That told me she already knew. Long enough, she said softly. I nodded once, slow, controlled. Then I turned back toward her. Then I think it's time they understand something, I said. Her expression tightened slightly. What? I looked past her, not at her, through her. At the invisible structure that had been built around my absence. That I have been silent, I said, but not absent. A pause. And silence eventually becomes decision. Lon didn't respond. Because she understood what I had begun to understand. This was no longer about accounts, or signatures, or access. It was about control of narrative itself. And somewhere, in a part of the house I could no longer see clearly, my family was still speaking about me as if I was already finished, not realizing that the foundation they were standing on had just begun to shift for the first time in 20 years. The first thing I did that morning was not speak. Not to Lon, not to my sons. Not to anyone who still believed the house belonged to them more than it belonged to memory. I simply sat at the dining table and listened, not to words, to patterns. Because once you stop reacting emotionally, you begin hearing what people are really doing when they think you are no longer a threat. Min was in the hallway again, on the phone, his voice low, controlled, rehearsed. Yes, we can proceed with the next step once the paperwork is confirmed. A pause. No, he hasn't signed anything new, but Lon is handling it. Lon, always Lon. Her name was now the bridge between them and whatever future they had already started building without me. I looked down at my hands. They didn't shake. That surprised me once. It doesn't anymore. Because betrayal doesn't always produce shock. Sometimes it produces clarity, the kind that strips emotion away until only structure remains. I stood up and walked toward the kitchen. The kettle was already warm. Someone had prepared it earlier. That detail mattered more than it should have. People who assume control often begin preparing for your absence before they admit they are causing it. I poured water into a cup and sat by the window. Outside, the rain had stopped, but the ground still looked unsettled, like the world hadn't decided yet whether it was finished reacting. Lon entered quietly. She didn't carry tea this time. She carried something else. A thin folder, different color than the others. She placed it on the table without speaking at first. Then she sat across from me. This is everything I could retrieve without triggering alerts, she said. I didn't open it immediately. I studied her instead. There was something different in her posture today. Not confidence, resignation. That is what happens when people realize they are no longer managing a system. They are only delaying its collapse. What did they tell you? I asked. Lon looked down. That you were declining mentally, she said. No hesitation, just delivery. I nodded once. That explanation is always convenient. It removes responsibility while sounding compassionate. And you believe them? I asked. She didn't answer quickly. That delay told me more than her words could have. I believed parts of it, she admitted. I finally opened the folder. Inside were bank summaries, property movement logs, insurance restructuring. Not recent, years. Layered, incremental. Not theft in one moment, but erosion over time. That is always how it happens when people believe the foundation will never notice. I flipped through slowly. Each page was a record of decisions made in rooms I was physically present in, but never mentally included in. A devastating truth about families is this: exclusion does not always look like distance. Sometimes it looks like being in the room while your presence is quietly removed from the outcome. I closed the folder and placed it down. They didn't just take access, I said quietly. They normalized replacement. Lon's voice lowered. Yes. A pause. Then she added something more carefully. And they've started preparing emotional narratives in case you resist. I looked up. What narratives? She hesitated, then answered. That you are confused, that you are unstable, that you are becoming difficult to care for. The words didn't surprise me. They confirmed something I had already begun to suspect. When people cannot control your decisions, they begin controlling your credibility. I leaned back in my chair. The wood creaked softly beneath me. I could hear Min again in the hallway now, closer this time. Not on the phone. With someone. Tuan. Their conversation was quieter than before, but not careful enough. You need to make sure he doesn't interfere, Tuan said. Min exhaled sharply. We are not interfering with him. We are protecting what's left of his stability. Protecting, again. Always protection as justification. I stood slowly. Lon noticed immediately. Where are you going? She asked. I didn't answer right away, because I was listening now to something beyond conversation. I was listening to timing, to alignment, to how long it had taken for them to reach this point. I walked into the hallway. They stopped speaking the moment they saw me. Not suddenly, gradually. Like people who have been trained to monitor my presence only when it becomes inconvenient. Min straightened slightly. Dad, he said, we were just discussing logistics. I nodded. Of course, I said. My voice was calm. That calm always unsettles people more than anger, because anger confirms emotion. Calm confirms control. Tuan looked uncomfortable. Not guilty, uncomfortable. There is a difference. I want to ask both of you something, I said. Silence. I continued. When did you decide I was no longer someone to inform, but someone to manage? Neither answered immediately. That hesitation again, that shared delay. Like they were checking which version of the truth was safest to say aloud. Min spoke first. It's not like that, he said. We are trying to make sure everything is handled properly. You've been under stress for a long time. Stress, another soft replacement word. I nodded slowly. And who defined that stress? I asked. No answer, so I continued. Because I don't remember asking to be removed from decisions about my own life. Tuan shifted slightly. Dad, that's not fair, he said. Fair, another word people use when they are no longer in control of the narrative. I looked at him, not sharply, just fully. Fair, I repeated, is what people say when they want equality without accountability. The hallway fell silent. Not comfortable silence, structural silence. The kind that appears when a system realizes its components are no longer aligned. Then I said it. Not loudly, not dramatically, just clearly enough to settle into them. I know about the replication of my signature. The reaction was immediate, but not visible in the way most people expect. It wasn't shock, it was containment. Min's eyes narrowed slightly. Tuan looked away first. That told me everything I needed. Because guilt avoids contact, control maintains it. Min spoke slowly. That's a misunderstanding. I nodded. I expected that response, I said. A pause. Then I added, what I didn't expect was how long you thought I would remain unaware. That line changed something in the room, not explosively, but irreversibly. Because once awareness is acknowledged, ignorance is no longer a defense. It becomes evidence. Lon appeared behind me in the hallway. She had heard everything. Her expression was no longer neutral. It was measured concern. Not for them, for timing, for consequence, for what comes next when containment fails. Min looked between us. Something in him finally shifted, not fear, calculation. The realization that multiple layers of oversight existed where he assumed there was only silence. And in that moment, I understood something I had been preparing for without naming it. They were not afraid of losing me. They were afraid I had never been lost at all. And somewhere deep in the structure of this house, the foundation they thought had been removed was beginning to remind them that it had never actually been gone. It had only been waiting. The silence after I spoke my last sentence didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a pause before recognition spreads through a system that has just realized it was built on something it no longer understands. Min didn't move at first. Tuan didn't speak. Even Lan remained still behind me, as if any interruption would break the fragile balance between what was hidden and what had finally surfaced. I walked back into the living room alone, not because I was retreating, because I wanted them to decide whether they would follow. That distinction matters more than most people realize. Control is not taking space. Control is deciding who follows into it. I sat down in the recliner again. The old wood groaned softly, familiar in a way that no longer felt comforting, only observant. The wristwatch was still there. 3:17. A frozen witness to time that refused to cooperate with the rest of the house. I placed it in my palm and closed my fingers around it. For the first time in years, I didn't feel nostalgia when I touched it. I felt distance. And distance, once fully understood, removes sentiment. Lan entered first. She didn't sit. She stood near the edge of the room, careful, as if the air itself had changed density. "They're going to escalate this," she said quietly. I didn't look at her immediately. "I know," I replied. A pause, then she added, "They think you are reacting emotionally now." I nodded once. "That is their first mistake." She studied me. "You're not reacting at all," she said. "No," I answered. "I stopped reacting years ago. I just didn't announce it." That truth seemed to unsettle her more than anything else so far. Because people rely on visible emotion to measure control. Without it, they cannot predict boundaries. From the hallway, voices again, Min and Tuan, lower now, more contained, more deliberate. "We need to move forward with the transition," Min said. "There's too much uncertainty now," Tuan replied. Uncertainty, another word people use when they lose dominance over interpretation. I stood up, slowly, not because I needed time, because I wanted them to hear movement before I arrived. Footsteps matter when silence has already been weaponized. I stepped into the hallway. They stopped immediately, not surprised, not relieved, measured. Min exhaled. "Dad," he said carefully, "we are not trying to exclude you." I tilted my head slightly. "That's an interesting sentence," I said. He frowned, because he understood what I meant. It was not denial, it was preemptive defense. I continued. "You only say that when exclusion is already in motion." No one responded. I walked closer to the hallway table where the documents had once been laid out. Now they were gone. Not removed, repositioned. That was important. Things don't disappear in controlled environments. They get relocated to places you are not supposed to question. "I want access to everything," I said calmly. Min shook his head. "That's not possible right now. There are legal procedures in motion." Legal procedures. I almost smiled again. "Procedures require consent," I said. Tuan spoke quickly. "You gave consent before." "It's already documented." I turned to him. "That is where you are mistaken," I said quietly. A pause. "I never gave informed consent. I gave trust." The word trust landed heavier than anything else in the room, because trust is what people exploit when they believe it is permanent. I continued, "And trust can be withdrawn." That sentence changed the atmosphere again, not dramatically, structurally, like a floor becoming aware it no longer has full support beneath it. Lon stepped forward slightly. "This is escalating too quickly," she said. I looked at her. "No," I replied calmly. "This has been escalating for years. You are just noticing it now because it is no longer contained." A silence followed. Outside, the faint sound of wind pressing against the house, not violent, persistent. Min's voice lowered. "What do you want, Dad?" That question. Finally. Not accusation, not justification. Question. I looked at him for a long time, not as a son, but as someone who had built an entire expectation of permanence on my silence. "I want what you assumed I would never ask for," I said. A pause. "Clarity." He frowned. "That doesn't make sense." I nodded. "It does," I replied, "but only if you accept that I was never unaware." Tuan stepped back slightly. That reaction mattered, because physical distance often appears when mental certainty collapses. I continued. "You assumed silence meant absence," I said, "but silence was just the condition under which I was allowed to see everything clearly." Min's jaw tightened. "You're saying you let this happen?" he asked. I shook my head slowly. "No," I said. "I am saying I watched it happen without interference. Those are not the same thing." The difference settled between us like something irreversible. Because interference implies participation, observation implies recording, and recording implies evidence. Lon's expression changed slightly. Not surprise. Recognition. She understood now what I had been doing all along, not resisting, not confronting, measuring, from inside the system. I turned slightly toward the table again. "And now," I said quietly, "I know exactly how much of this house no longer requires me to function." That sentence landed differently, because it reframed everything, not as loss, but as replacement already completed. Min looked at Lan, then back at me. For the first time, uncertainty was no longer theoretical. It was present, real, and expanding. Because the structure they thought they controlled had already begun to acknowledge a different authority inside it, one that had been silent for 20 years and was no longer interested in remaining invisible. The house felt smaller after I spoke, not physically, structurally, as if every word I had finally chosen to say had tightened the space between walls that had been quietly expanding around my absence for years. Min didn't look at me the same way anymore. That was the first visible change. Not fear, not respect, awareness. There is a difference between those three things, and families only notice it when it is already too late to pretend otherwise. I walked back to the living room alone again, not because I needed isolation, because I needed them to decide whether they still had permission to follow me into silence. Lan remained in the hallway for a moment longer. Then she followed, not close, not distant, measured. The way someone walks behind a collapsing structure they once helped stabilize. I sat in the recliner again. The wristwatch was still in my hand. 3:17, frozen like it had been waiting for this exact moment of recognition. I placed it on the table carefully, not with reverence, with finality. From the hallway, I heard Min speaking again, lower now, controlled in a different way. "This is becoming unstable," he said. Tuan replied, "We need a backup plan if he refuses cooperation." Backup plan. That phrase did not surprise me. It confirmed something I had already calculated long before they spoke it aloud. People rarely change direction when confronted. They reinforce structure. Lan stepped forward slightly, her voice quiet but firm. "You are misunderstanding the situation," she said to them. Min turned toward her. "Then explain it," he said. A pause. Lan looked at me briefly, not for permission, for acknowledgement. I gave none, because she didn't need it anymore. "You're treating him like a variable that stopped responding," she said carefully. "But he is not the variable. He is the system you built everything around." Silence followed. Not emotional silence, functional silence, the kind that appears when a model stops matching reality. I stood up. This time, I didn't wait for them to notice. I walked into the hallway deliberately. My footsteps were slow, not hesitant. Controlled. Min and Tuan both looked at me immediately, not as a father, not as an authority, as a risk factor. That distinction matters more than anything else now. I stopped a few steps away from them. "I heard the word backup plan," I said calmly. Neither responded. I nodded once. "Good," I continued. Then we are finally speaking the same language. Tuan frowned. Dad, you're misinterpreting. I raised a hand slightly. He stopped. Not because I forced him, because interruption no longer felt safe. I continued. I am not misinterpreting anything, I said. I am acknowledging it. A pause. You are preparing for a version of this family where I am no longer able to interfere. Min shifted slightly. That's not... I looked at him. He stopped mid-sentence. Not fear. Recognition of accuracy. I stepped closer to the table in the hallway where new documents had appeared. Different ones this time. Simplified. Reduced. Finalization drafts. My name still present, but in a different position. Not as owner, as recipient. I ran my finger along the edge of one page. You've already moved the accounts, I said quietly. Min didn't answer. That silence was confirmation. I looked at Tuan. And you've already discussed what happens if I challenge it. Another silence, shorter this time, more defensive. I nodded slowly. Then let me make something equally clear, I said. The room tightened. Even Lan stopped moving behind me, because she understood the tone shift. This was no longer observation, it was declaration. I will not challenge it emotionally, I said. A pause. I will not argue for access that has already been redefined. I looked at them both. Because you have already made your decision. Min exhaled. Relief flickered for a second, but it was premature because I wasn't finished. I am simply informing you, I continued, that I will begin removing what I am responsible for. That sentence landed differently, not as threat, as consequence. Tuan frowned again. What does that mean? I turned slightly toward him. It means, I said calmly, you will begin to understand what parts of your life were sustained by my participation. Silence again, but this silence was different. It was no longer confusion, it was anticipation. Min finally spoke. You're talking about money. I nodded. That is one layer. A pause, but not the only one. Lan's eyes narrowed slightly. She understood before they did, and that understanding made her posture change. Not fear, calculation of scale. I continued. For 20 years, I said, I did not just fund your stability. A pause. I absorbed your instability. The hallway grew still. Even the air felt less cooperative. You didn't just rely on my money, I said quietly. You relied on my silence when things went wrong, my name when things needed approval, my presence when things needed legitimacy. I looked at Min. You built your decisions on the assumption that I would always absorb the consequences. Min's voice tightened. That's not fair. I nodded slowly. There it is again, I said. He frowned. That word. I continued. You only use it when consequences begin returning to their origin. A long silence followed, this one heavier, because something had shifted from emotional conflict to structural exposure. Lan finally spoke. You don't need to escalate this, she said softly. I looked at her. I am not escalating, I replied. I am separating. That word changed the atmosphere again. Separating. Not destroying, not punishing. Separating. As if something that had been artificially connected for too long was finally being returned to its original components. I stepped back slightly. And I want you to understand something very clearly, I said. All three of them focused now, not as family, as system participants waiting for outcome definition. I did not stay silent for 20 years because I was unaware, I said. A pause. I stayed silent because I wanted to know exactly what would remain when I stopped holding everything together. The room stopped responding after that, not because nothing was happening, but because something had already begun happening underneath everything they were still trying to name. And I realized then, for the first time in years, they were no longer reacting to me. They were reacting to what they were about to lose. And they still didn't fully understand what that loss actually included. The silence that followed didn't feel like hesitation anymore. It felt like recalibration. Min was the first to break eye contact, not because he was defeated, but because he was trying to rebuild the internal logic of a situation that no longer behaved the way he expected. That is what happens when people lose the illusion of predictability. They don't panic immediately, they reorganize. Tuan looked at me differently now, less like a son trying to justify something, more like someone trying to determine what I could still do to them. That thought alone told me enough. I turned slightly, not to leave, not to advance, but to position myself where I could see all three of them at once, my sons, and Lan standing slightly behind the threshold of influence she had occupied for years. A triangle of decisions I had once funded without knowing I was building it. "I want to make something clear," I said. No one interrupted. That was new. Or rather, it was the first time their silence was no longer obedience, it was uncertainty about what interruption would cost. "I am not angry," I said. That line alone changed Min's expression, because anger is easier to manage than absence of it. "I am not confused," I continued. Tuan shifted slightly. "And I am not negotiating." Lan lowered her gaze for a brief second. That one was important, because negotiation implies shared control over outcome. What I was doing no longer included that premise. I walked slowly toward the table again, where the latest documents still lay. I didn't touch them this time. I didn't need to. "I spent 20 years, I said, making sure none of you ever experienced consequences faster than I could absorb them." A pause. "That wasn't love," I added quietly. "It was containment." Min frowned slightly. "You're framing it like we exploited you," he said. I looked at him, not sharply, just directly. "Yes," I replied. That single word removed all ambiguity from the room. For a moment, no one spoke. Even the house itself felt like it was waiting for them to decide whether reality had just been accepted or rejected. Tuan finally spoke. "We didn't force you to do anything," he said, but his voice lacked certainty. I nodded slowly. "You didn't need to," I said. A pause. "You only needed to assume I would continue." That is the difference most families never recognize until it is too late. Exploitation does not always require coercion. Sometimes it only requires continuity of expectation. Lan stepped forward slightly. "This is becoming irreversible," she said softly. I turned toward her. "It already was," I replied. A long pause followed. Then I continued. "The only thing that changed today is that you are now aware of it." That sentence landed differently, not as accusation, as transition. Min exhaled sharply. "So what happens now?" he asked. There it was, the first real question. Not defensive, not performative, functional. I studied him for a moment. Not as someone I raised, but as someone who had learned how to rely on my silence more than my instruction. "What happens now," I said quietly, "is you begin to experience what my absence actually costs." Tuan frowned. "You're talking about leaving?" he asked. I shook my head slowly. "No," I said. A pause. "I am talking about stopping." That distinction mattered. Leaving suggests distance. Stopping suggests removal of function. Lan's expression tightened slightly. She understood immediately. Min didn't yet. Tuan was still trying. "What exactly are you stopping?" Min asked carefully. I looked at the table again. At the invisible system they still didn't fully see. Then I answered. "Everything I have been quietly doing that no one ever asked about," I said. A pause. "And everything you assumed would continue indefinitely." The room tightened again, because that category was larger than they were prepared to calculate quickly. Min's voice lowered. "You're being dramatic," he said, but it lacked conviction. I nodded once. "No," I replied calmly. "I am being accurate." Lan stepped closer now. Her voice was quieter than before. "If you do that," she said, "there will be immediate gaps." I turned to her. "Yes," I said. She hesitated. "And you understand what that will trigger?" I nodded again. "I do." Silence followed. Not confusion anymore. Recognition of cascading dependency. Because systems like this do not collapse evenly. They fail in sequence, one dependency at a time. Tuan spoke again, slower this time. You planned this. It wasn't a question. I looked at him. I observed it, I corrected. A pause. Planning would imply I altered its direction. That distinction made him uncomfortable again. Min finally stepped forward slightly, his voice lower now. This will hurt people, he said. I met his gaze. Yes, I replied. A pause. It will reveal who those people were relying on more than they admitted. That answer removed the last illusion of emotional framing, because now it was no longer about conflict. It was about exposure. Lon closed her eyes briefly, as if calculating something internally. Then she spoke again. You don't need to do this all at once, she said. I looked at her. I am not doing anything, I said. A pause. I stopped doing. That was the final clarification. The room went quiet again, but this time no one tried to fill it, because they had finally understood something they had avoided for years. I was not withdrawing attention. I was withdrawing function. And once function is removed from a system that has depended on it for decades, what remains is not collapse immediately. It is revelation. And revelation is always slower and far more precise than anyone is ready for. The first real crack didn't happen in the house. It happened in the silence after I stopped speaking. Not dramatic silence, functional silence, the kind where everyone is still standing in the same room, but the rules that once held the room together no longer apply. Min checked his phone. That small gesture told me everything I needed to know. He wasn't looking for information. He was looking for confirmation that the outside world still functioned normally. Tuan followed a moment later, as if instinctively matching his brother's behavior. Lon didn't move at all. She already understood what the others were still trying to deny. I walked toward the window. Outside, the street looked unchanged. That is always the first deception systems rely on. From the outside, nothing appears broken while the inside quietly reorganizes itself into failure. I want you to listen carefully, I said without turning. No one responded immediately, not because they refused, because they were no longer sure what response would still count as control. I am not punishing you, I said. A pause. I am removing dependency. That word landed differently. Min finally spoke. You keep saying that like it's neutral. I turned slightly. It is neutral, I said. You are just not used to hearing consequences described without emotional packaging. Silence again. Tuan rubbed his forehead slightly. For the first time, I saw something new in him. Not defiance, fatigue. That is usually the first internal signal people miss when systems begin to fail. Lon spoke quietly. You are collapsing their structure in real time, she said. I nodded. Yes. No hesitation, no justification, just acknowledgement. Min's voice sharpened slightly. You're talking like this is intentional harm. I looked at him. No, I said calmly. A pause. This is exposure of harm that was already distributed over time. That sentence did something to him. Not emotionally, structurally, because it removed the illusion of a single event to blame. He looked away again. That avoidance was no longer emotional. It was computational. He was trying to map what remained without me. I stepped back toward the table. The documents were still there, but they no longer felt like power. They felt like evidence of a system that had been running longer than anyone admitted. I want something returned, I said. Lon looked up immediately. What? She asked. I pointed lightly at the table. Access, I said. Min shook his head quickly. That's not possible right now, he said again, but this time the phrase sounded weaker. I nodded. I know. A pause. I didn't ask because I expect compliance, I added. That made him pause. Then why? Tuan asked. I looked at both of them. Because I want you to understand something before the next stage begins. Lon's expression tightened slightly. She already knew what I meant. Min didn't. Not yet, I continued. When I stop absorbing consequences, I said, they don't disappear. A pause. They return to origin points. That sentence changed the room again, not emotionally, causally. Min frowned. What origin points? I looked at him. You'll find out, I said simply. Silence followed, but now it was different. No longer uncertainty, anticipation of impact. Lan stepped slightly closer to me. Some of this can still be slowed, she said quietly. I shook my head once. No, I replied. A pause. It can only be revealed. That was the moment I saw it in her face. Not fear, acceptance of scale. Because she understood what I had understood long before anyone else in the room. This was not a family disagreement. This was a long-running dependency system finally losing its hidden engine. Min finally spoke again, slower now. If you do this, he said, you're going to destabilize everything. I nodded. Yes. A pause. That is the point. Tuan looked at me again, but this time his voice was quieter. You're willing to do that to your own family? That question should have carried emotional weight, but in this moment, it didn't, because I had already removed myself from emotional framing. I answered honestly. I already lived through 20 years of being used as stability without acknowledgement, I said. A pause. This is not willingness, I added. It is correction. The word landed heavily. Correction implies something already measured, already understood, already concluded. Min's expression hardened again, but it lacked direction now, because anger requires a target, and I was no longer behaving like one. I was behaving like a process. Lan exhaled slowly. You should prepare for immediate financial reaction, she said quietly. I nodded. I already have. That surprised her slightly, not because I was prepared, but because I had already separated myself from the emotional urgency of preparation. Min stepped forward. What did you do? He asked. I looked at him. For a long moment I didn't answer, not for dramatic effect, but because I was considering how much of the truth they were now capable of receiving without collapsing prematurely. Finally, I spoke. I stopped correcting errors that were never reported to you, I said. A pause. And I stopped covering delays you never saw. Silence again. This one deeper, because now they understood. This wasn't about removal of support, it was about exposure of invisible support. Lan closed her eyes briefly. She understood the cascading model now. Min did not yet fully grasp it, but he felt its shape forming. Tuan finally spoke, softer than before. How long do we have? I looked at the wristwatch on the table. 3:17, still unchanged. Then I looked back at them. You already have less time than you think, I said quietly. A pause. Because some systems don't collapse when they are attacked. I stepped back slightly. They collapse when support is no longer silently compensating for them. And in that moment, I saw it land. Not as fear, not as anger, but as recognition that something fundamental in their environment had just stopped behaving like it always had. And for the first time in 20 years, I was no longer the invisible structure beneath their lives. I was simply the one who had stepped away from holding it up. The first sign of real change was not in what they said. It was in what they stopped asking me to fix. That morning, the house felt unusually active, but not toward me. Min was on the phone again, pacing near the kitchen. Tuan stood by the hallway table scrolling through documents with sharper, faster movements than before. Lan moved between rooms in silence, not interrupting, not intervening, just observing the way a doctor watches a condition after the treatment has already been removed. I sat at the dining table, unmoved, uninvited, unneeded. That last part was the one they were still learning to process. The kettle clicked off behind me. No one reached for it. For years, I had been the one who noticed those small things, the boiling water, the overdue bills, the quiet emotional shifts no one named until they became emergencies. Now those small things were beginning to remain unnoticed. And that was the beginning of what I had intended, not collapse. Correction. Min ended his call abruptly and looked at me for a second longer than usual. Not anger this time, concern mixed with calculation. "Accounts are already showing irregularities," he said. I nodded once. "I know." Tuan frowned. "You're not denying it?" I looked at him. "No," I said calmly. "I'm not correcting it anymore." That sentence did not land emotionally. It landed structurally. Lon stepped into the room slowly. "This is accelerating faster than expected," she said quietly. I nodded again. "It always does once dependency stops being compensated." Min exhaled sharply. "You're talking like you've already accepted damage." I turned slightly toward him. "I have accepted reality," I corrected. A pause. "Damage is what you call it when you still believe it can be reversed without consequence." Silence. Not comfortable, not uncertain, evaluative. They were no longer debating whether something was happening. They were measuring how far it had already gone. Tuan spoke again, slower now. "Some services stopped responding this morning," he said. I nodded. "Yes." Min's eyes tightened. "You did that." It wasn't a question. I looked at him. "I stopped maintaining systems that were never acknowledged as dependent on maintenance," I said. That distinction mattered, because I had not broken anything. I had simply stopped compensating for its weaknesses. Lon's voice softened slightly. "You're forcing visibility," she said. I nodded once. "Yes." A pause. "And visibility is what they were avoiding." Min stepped forward. "This is going to affect people outside this house," he said. I looked at him for a long moment, then replied calmly, "It already was affecting people outside this house." That answer confused him slightly. Not because he didn't understand the words, but because he was not used to hearing consequences described without emotional shielding. Tuan rubbed his hands together briefly. "Dad, what exactly are you trying to achieve?" That question again, but now it sounded different, less defensive, more destabilized. I looked at him, not as a son, but as someone trying to interpret a system he had been benefiting from without seeing. "I am not trying to achieve anything," I said quietly. A pause. "I am stopping participation in something you assumed was permanent." Silence. Lon stepped closer to the table. For the first time, she placed something down in front of me. A second set of documents. Not financial this time. Operational logs, service dependencies, payment authorizations tied indirectly to my accounts. She didn't speak immediately, but her eyes told me she had made a decision. "They're already trying to reroute responsibility," she said quietly. I looked at the documents, then nodded. "Good," I said. That single word made all three of them pause, because it was not approval. It was confirmation of expected behavior. Min's voice sharpened again. "You're acting like this was your plan all along." I looked at him. "No," I said calmly. A pause. "I am acting like I understood what would happen when I stopped preventing it from happening." That difference was no longer abstract. It was now visible in their reactions. Tuan looked down at the floor briefly. Min exhaled again, slower this time. For the first time, I saw something new in him, not resistance, adaptation beginning too late. Lon finally spoke again. "There will be consequences within hours," she said. I nodded. "Yes." She studied me. "And you are prepared for that?" I looked at the wristwatch on the table, 3:17, still unchanged, still marking a moment that refused to move forward. Then I looked back at her. "I have been prepared for 20 years, I said quietly. That was the truth they had never considered. Preparation does not always look like action. Sometimes it looks like patience extended beyond recognition. Min spoke again, but his voice had shifted slightly. "Why now?" he asked. I paused, not because I didn't know the answer, but because the answer was something they had not yet emotionally accepted the scale of. "Because now," I said, "you were capable of seeing the difference between what I did for you," a pause, "and what you assumed would always exist without me." The room went still again, but this time it wasn't the stillness of confusion, it was the stillness of recognition beginning to spread, not fully formed, not fully accepted, but irreversible. And as I sat there, watching the first real reactions ripple through a system that had never been forced to function without me, I realized something simple. They were no longer reacting to my words. They were reacting to the absence of what my silence had always been covering, and that absence was only just beginning to be understood. The second day felt different in a way no one said out loud. Not quieter, strained, like a system running on delayed feedback, unsure which signals could still be trusted. Min didn't leave the house that morning, neither did Tuan. That alone told me the situation had already moved beyond discussion and into containment. Lon was the only one who still moved between rooms with purpose, but even her steps had changed. Less intervention, more observation. She was no longer adjusting the system, she was documenting it. I sat in the same chair as always. Same position, same wristwatch on the table. 3:17. Still frozen, still marking a moment that no longer belonged to time. Min finally spoke from the kitchen doorway. "Several accounts are frozen," he said. Not accusing, reporting. That shift mattered more than anything else so far. I nodded once. "I expected that," I said. Tuan looked at me sharply. "You expected financial restrictions?" he asked. I turned slightly. "No," I replied calmly. "I expected dependency to be reevaluated the moment it stopped being silently absorbed." Silence followed. Lon stepped in slowly. "They've already contacted external managers," she said. I nodded again. "Yes," Min frowned. "You're not surprised by anything." I looked at him. "I am no longer in a position where surprise is useful," I said. That sentence changed the tone in the room again, because surprise implies instability of expectation, and I had no more expectations left to lose. Tuan rubbed his forehead again, slower now. "This is affecting payments tied to our business accounts," he said. I nodded. "Yes." Min's voice tightened. "You're cutting everything." I looked at him. "No," I corrected. A pause. "I stopped correcting everything." That distinction landed heavily, because correction implies ongoing intervention, and intervention implies responsibility. I had removed both. Juan spoke quietly. "They're going to escalate legally within days," she said. I nodded. "I know." She studied me carefully. "And you're allowing that?" I turned toward her. "I am not allowing anything," I said calmly. A pause. "I am no longer positioned to prevent outcomes you initiated." That sentence shifted something in her expression. Not shock, recognition of inevitability. Min stepped forward slightly. "This is going to destroy stability," he said again. But now the phrase sounded less like accusation and more like realization. I looked at him for a long moment, then spoke. "Stability built on silent compensation is not stability," I said quietly. "It is delay." Silence followed, not emotional, structural. Tuan finally spoke again, softer than before. "So what happens now?" That question again, but this time it carried no assumption of control, only uncertainty. I looked at all three of them, not as participants in my family, but as individuals standing inside a system they had never fully seen. "What happens now," I said slowly, "is that everything I once absorbed begins returning to its origin point." A pause. "And you will each discover which parts of your life were supported by my silence more than your decisions." The room tightened again, not emotionally, functionally. Lon exhaled quietly. "You understand they will blame you," she said. I nodded once. Yes. That answer did not require emotion, only acknowledgement. Min's voice lowered. "You're willing to accept that?" I looked at him. "I already have." A pause. Blame is what people assign when they are forced to see what they depended on. Silence again. Outside, faint movement from the street. Life continuing as if none of this mattered yet. But inside the house, something irreversible had begun. Tuan finally spoke again. "This isn't just about money anymore," he said. I nodded. "No," I agreed. A pause. "It never was." Lon stepped closer to me slightly. For the first time, her voice carried something more personal. "If this continues at this pace," she said quietly, "you will be isolated from the family entirely." I looked at her. "That already happened," I said calmly. A pause. "They just hadn't noticed it yet." That sentence hit differently, because it reframed everything that had happened so far, not as beginning, but as delayed recognition. Min looked away again, not in anger this time, in processing, because for the first time, he was beginning to see something he had never accounted for. My absence was not something they were preparing for. It was something they had already been living inside without understanding it. I stood slowly. The chair creaked softly beneath me. All three of them watched without speaking, not because they were afraid, but because they were no longer sure what action would still produce stability. I picked up the wristwatch. 3:17, still unchanged, still refusing forward motion. I placed it back down carefully. Then I spoke one final line for that moment. "You are not witnessing collapse," I said quietly. A pause. "You are witnessing exposure." And for the first time since this began, no one tried to respond immediately, because they finally understood that what was unfolding was not a reaction to what I had done, but the delayed consequence of what I had been carrying alone for 20 years. That night, no one turned on the television, not because anyone agreed to silence it, but because sound itself felt unnecessary, like an outdated habit from a version of the house that no longer matched what was happening inside it. Min stayed in the study. Tuan remained in the hallway more often than not, as if moving too far in either direction would trigger consequences he couldn't yet predict. Lon moved once every hour, checking something on her phone, then stopping, then checking again. Her calm had shifted into controlled attention, the kind people develop when they realize they are standing inside a system that is no longer stable enough to ignore. I remained seated in the living room, same chair, same position, same wristwatch on the table, 3:17, still frozen. But now it felt less like a memory and more like a measurement, a fixed point the rest of the house was slowly drifting away from. Around midnight, Min finally came out of the study. He didn't speak immediately. He stood in the doorway as if deciding whether the room still belonged to him or whether it had already been reassigned in ways he hadn't yet been informed of. "Some transfers are failing to process," he said, not blaming, not accusing, reporting again. That change in tone mattered more than anything else. I nodded once. "I expected that," I said. Tuan appeared behind him almost immediately. "We need clarification on what you actually stopped," he said. I looked at him for a moment, not because I was unsure of the answer, but because I was deciding how much truth they were now capable of receiving without collapsing into denial again. "I stopped correcting financial drift," I said calmly. A pause. "I stopped covering misalignment in accounts you were managing under assumptions I never confirmed." Silence followed. Min frowned slightly. "That sounds like you're describing sabotage," he said. I looked at him. "No," I replied. A pause. "It sounds like you are hearing the absence of correction for the first time." That sentence landed heavily. Lon stepped forward slightly. "They are experiencing dependency shock," she said quietly. I nodded. "Yes." Tuan exhaled sharply. "So everything slows down because you stopped fixing things?" I turned toward him. "No," I said calmly. A pause. Everything slows down because you are now seeing what was never stable without correction. Silence again. Min rubbed his forehead. "This is going to affect external partners," he said. I nodded. Yes. No hesitation, no attempt to soften it. That clarity unsettled him more than anything else so far. Lon spoke quietly. "You need to understand," she said to them. "This is not retaliation." I looked at her briefly. It wasn't entirely correct, but it also wasn't entirely wrong. It was something older than retaliation. It was structural withdrawal. Min's voice lowered. "You've essentially removed yourself from the system," he said. I nodded once. Yes. A pause. "And now the system is revealing what it relied on." Tuan looked at me more carefully now. Not anger, not resistance. Recognition forming slowly. "You held everything together without telling us," he said quietly. I looked at him. "I held it together because you never asked whether it was holding," I replied. That sentence changed the room again. Not emotionally, fundamentally. Because it reframed responsibility, not as action taken, but as absence of inquiry. Lon exhaled slowly. "They will escalate by morning," she said. I nodded. "I know." Min stepped forward slightly. "What happens when legal teams get involved?" he asked. I looked at him, then answered simply. "Then what was silent becomes documented." That line shifted something deeper in him, because documentation removes ambiguity, and ambiguity had been their strongest protection. Tuan spoke again, quieter now. "You're willing to take this all the way?" I paused, not because I was uncertain, but because I was finalizing the shape of the answer in a way they could not misinterpret. "I am not taking anything anywhere," I said calmly. A pause. "I am no longer carrying what was never acknowledged as being carried." Silence followed, longer this time, heavier. Min looked down for a moment, not defeated, but recalculating. Lon stepped slightly closer to me again. Her voice was lower now. "There is something else you should know," she said. I looked at her. She hesitated, not from fear, from consequence awareness. "They are already preparing a narrative," she said. I nodded. "Yes." She continued. "They are framing this as cognitive decline and emotional instability." I exhaled slowly. That was expected. Because systems rarely admit dependency first, they redefine the source. Min didn't deny it. That told me it was already in motion. Tuan looked uncomfortable now, not because of guilt, but because he was beginning to realize that narratives travel faster than truth when they are simpler. I stood up slowly. The chair creaked. The wristwatch remained unchanged. 3:17, still holding the moment steady while everything else moved around it. I looked at all three of them, and for the first time that night, I spoke without reference to systems, accounts, or structure. "I have one question for you," I said quietly. They all looked at me, not as authority, not as problem, as inevitability. I continued. "When everything I was quietly holding stops responding," a pause, "who do you think you become without it?" No one answered immediately, because that was no longer a financial question or a legal question. It was the first question that could not be redirected anywhere else. And in the silence that followed, for the first time, I saw all three of them begin to realize that the answer was not something they had prepared for. It was something they were already about to discover, whether they were ready or not. Morning didn't arrive gently. It arrived like a correction. Phones started ringing before anyone had fully spoken a word in the house. Not once, not twice. A steady escalation of interruptions that no one could ignore anymore. Min answered the first call in the kitchen. His voice was controlled at first, professional. Then it tightened. Then it stopped pretending. Tuan stood near the doorway, watching him without speaking, already understanding that whatever was being said on the other end had nothing to do with interpretation anymore. It was confirmation. Lon stood further back than the others now, not removed, but no longer between them and consequence. I remained in the living room, same chair, same posture, same wristwatch. 3:17, still unchanged. The only thing that had not yet reacted. Min walked into the living room after the call ended. He didn't sit. He didn't speak immediately. He just looked at me. But this time, the expression had changed again. Not anger, not calculation. Recognition that something outside the house had begun aligning with what I had already described. "You knew this would happen this fast," he said. I nodded once. Yes, no hesitation. That answer no longer surprised him. Tuan stepped forward slightly. "It's not just accounts," he said. I looked at him. "No," I replied calmly.
A pause. "It never was."
Silence followed. Lon finally spoke. "External partners are pulling agreements," she said quietly. "Not dramatic, not emotional, just factual." Min exhaled sharply. "That shouldn't be possible overnight," he said. I looked at him. "It isn't overnight," I replied. A pause. "It's the first time you are seeing what was already in motion." That sentence landed differently now, because now they were no longer questioning whether something was happening. They were measuring how long it had already been happening without their awareness. Tuan rubbed his hands together again. "So what now?" he asked. But this time, the question was different, not procedural, not defensive, uncertain in a deeper way. I looked at him for a long moment, then answered. "Now," I said quietly, "you experience what happens when systems built on invisible correction stop receiving it." Min shook his head slightly. "You keep saying that like you're not involved," he said. I met his gaze. "I am not involved anymore," I said. A pause. "That is what you are witnessing." Silence followed again, but it was no longer confusion. It was adjustment. Reluctant, unstable adjustment. Lon stepped forward slightly. "This is accelerating into full restructuring," she said. I nodded. "Yes." Min finally spoke again, voice lower. "People are going to ask questions." I nodded once. "Yes." Tuan added quietly. "They will want explanations." I looked at him. "Yes." A pause. "And you will not be able to give them the version you were preparing," I said calmly. That line changed the room again, because it acknowledged something they had not fully admitted yet. They had already begun constructing a narrative, and I had already begun dismantling the conditions that allowed it to hold. Min's voice tightened. "You're isolating us." I looked at him. "No," I said. A pause. "You are experiencing what happens when insulation is removed from a structure that was never designed to stand alone." Silence. Longer this time. Heavier. Tuan finally spoke again, quieter now. "You didn't just stop helping," he said. I nodded. "Yes." A pause. "I stopped compensating." Lon closed her eyes briefly, because she understood the difference more than anyone else in the room. Min looked away again, not in anger now, in processing, because for the first time he could not locate where control had ended and consequence had begun. The wristwatch remained still. 3:17. Not moving, not reacting. A frozen anchor in a house that was no longer stable around it. I stood up slowly. This time, no one reacted immediately. Not because they ignored me, because they were no longer sure what my movement meant. I walked toward the table. The documents were still there, but now they looked different. Not as leverage, not as accusation. As records of a system already mid-transition. "I want you to understand something," I said quietly. All eyes followed me now, not with authority, with inevitability. "I did not remove stability from this household," I said. A pause. "I removed my compensation for instability you chose not to acknowledge." Silence followed. Then I added softly, "And now you are discovering the difference between those two things." That was the moment I saw it clearly. Not collapse, not punishment. Recognition spreading through the structure like a delayed realization that the support system had already stepped away long before anyone noticed. Min finally spoke. "This can't continue like this," he said. I looked at him, not unkindly, not emotionally, just truthfully. "It already has," I said. A pause. "You are simply no longer insulated from it." And in that moment, for the first time since this began, no one in the room tried to correct me. Because they finally understood something they had resisted for years. I had not changed the system. I had only stopped holding it together quietly enough that they never had to notice it was me. By the third day, the house no longer sounded like a home. It sounded like coordination, short phone calls, interrupted conversations, doors opening and closing without rhythm, names mentioned in passing that were no longer spoken in full sentences. Everything had become transactional, even silence. Min stopped pretending to sleep properly. Tuan stopped pretending he understood the situation. Lon stopped pretending she could still contain it. And I stopped pretending any of this was new. I sat in the living room early that morning before anyone else fully gathered themselves. The wristwatch was still on the table, 3:17. It had become less an object and more a reference point for everything else that was failing to move forward correctly. Min entered first. He didn't sit. He didn't greet. He simply stood in front of me with a phone in his hand. "Two more institutions pulled back support overnight," he said. Not emotional, not accusatory, just reporting decline. I nodded once. "Yes," I said. Tuan followed behind him. His face looked heavier now. Not tired in the physical sense, tired in the recognition that effort no longer guaranteed stability. "This isn't slowing down," he said. I looked at him. "No," I replied calmly. "It isn't." Silence followed. Lon entered last. She didn't speak immediately. She looked at both of them first, then at me. Then she exhaled slowly. "It's cascading," she said quietly. I nodded again. "Yes." Min finally spoke. "This is beyond family systems now," he said. I looked at him. "It always was," I replied. A pause. "You just experienced it as family because I made sure it never became anything else for you." That sentence landed differently again. Because it removed the last comforting illusion. That this had been contained, that it had been personal, that it had been reversible. Tuan stepped forward slightly. "What happens if it continues like this?" he asked. I studied him for a moment, not as a son, but as someone beginning to understand structure after relying on it blindly for too long. "Then," I said quietly, "everything that depended on silent correction will begin to reveal its real operating cost." Silence. Not confused anymore. Measuring. Min rubbed his forehead briefly. "So this is about control," he said. I shook my head once. "No," I replied. A pause. "This is about visibility." Lon stepped forward slightly. "They are already calling external advisors," she said. I nodded. "Yes." She studied me carefully. "And you are not responding to any of it?" I looked at her. "No," I said. A pause. "Because response implies participation." That distinction mattered more now than anything else. Min exhaled sharply. "You're dismantling everything," he said. I met his gaze. "No," I corrected. I stopped maintaining what was already being dismantled in practice without acknowledgement. A pause. Silence followed again. But this silence was no longer emotional. It was structural awareness forming. Tuan spoke quietly. "So what are we supposed to do now?" That question again. But now it carried something different. Not resistance, not expectation. Loss of reference point. I looked at him, and for a moment, I did not answer as someone within the system. I answered as someone who had already stepped outside its logic. "You learn what remains when invisible support stops compensating," I said quietly. A pause. "And you adjust to what you actually built instead of what you assumed was being built for you." Silence followed again. Longer this time. heavier. Lon exhaled slowly. "This is going to reach public awareness," she said quietly. I nodded. Yes. No hesitation, no concern expressed, just acknowledgement. Min looked at me again. "This will change how people see you," he said. I looked at him. "That part is already finished," I replied. A pause. "What matters now is how they will see what you depended on without realizing it." That sentence shifted something again, because it reframed reputation as irrelevant and dependency as exposed. Tuan looked down briefly, not ashamed, not angry, disoriented, because for the first time he was realizing that stability had never been a fixed condition. It had been continuous maintenance, and I had been the one maintaining it, without ever naming it. The wristwatch ticked in no direction. 3:17, still unchanged, still refusing forward motion. I stood up slowly. This time, no one reacted immediately. Not because they were indifferent, because reaction no longer felt like control. I walked toward the window. Outside, life continued in fragments that didn't yet reflect the internal collapse happening behind closed doors. That is always how it begins. Outside first sees continuity. Inside first recognizes loss. "I want you to understand something clearly," I said without turning. All three of them went quiet. "I am not removing stability from you," I said. A pause. "I am removing myself from compensating for instability you no longer get to ignore." Silence followed. Then I added, softly, "And what remains after that is what you built, not what I carried." And for the first time, there was no argument, no correction, no resistance. Only the beginning of recognition that what they had been calling structure for years had only ever been balance maintained by someone who finally stopped holding it. The first time Min stopped talking, it wasn't dramatic. It was mid-sentence. He had been explaining something on the phone, fast, controlled, practiced. The kind of language people use when they still believe words can stabilize what is already slipping. Then he paused, listened. His face changed before the call even ended. Not shock, not anger. Realignment failing in real time. He lowered the phone slowly. For a moment, he didn't speak to anyone. Not me, not Tuan, not even Lan. He just stood there, like the room had stopped recognizing his authority as something that could be transmitted through speech. "What did they say?" Tuan asked. Min didn't answer immediately. That silence told us more than the call itself. Finally, he spoke. "They're suspending all pending approvals until review is complete," he said. Not emotion, not interpretation, just consequence. Lan closed her eyes briefly. I remained seated, same chair, same position, same wristwatch. 3:17, still unchanged. Still refusing to acknowledge movement that had already started everywhere else. Tuan looked at me again. But this time, it wasn't accusation. It was searching for structure. "What does review mean in this context?" he asked. I answered calmly. "It means they no longer trust the system they previously accepted without inspection." Silence followed. Min finally sat down across from me. Not because he was told to, because standing had stopped providing advantage. For the first time, his posture didn't carry control. It carried calculation. "You expected this level of shutdown," he said. I nodded once. Yes. No hesitation. Lan spoke quietly from behind him. "This isn't a negotiation phase anymore," she said. I looked at her. "No," I agreed. A pause. "It is verification." Tuan frowned slightly. "Verification of what?" I turned toward him. "Whether what remained without me was actually stable," I said. Silence followed again. Longer this time. Heavier. Because now the framing had changed. This was no longer about withdrawal. It was about testing what had always been assumed. Min leaned forward slightly. "You've essentially forced every external system to reassess us at once," he said. I nodded. "Yes." A pause. "Because they were all synchronized through assumptions that were never independently verified." That sentence made him stop speaking for a moment. Not because he disagreed, because he understood it too well. Lan stepped closer. Some of them are already questioning long-term legitimacy of previous transactions, she said quietly. I nodded again. Yes. Tuan rubbed his hands together. This is going to take months to stabilize, he said. I looked at him. No, I corrected gently. A pause. It will take months to redefine what was actually stable in the first place. Silence followed. Min exhaled slowly. You're acting like you're outside of this, he said. I looked at him directly. I am, I replied calmly. A pause. That is the difference you are finally experiencing. The room tightened again, not emotionally, structurally, because that sentence made something unavoidable clear. I was no longer a participant in their system. I was the absence it was reacting to. Lan spoke again, softer now. There is something else, she said. All eyes turned toward her. She hesitated, not from doubt, from consequence awareness. They are starting to re-examine long-standing authorizations tied to your name, she said, looking at me. I nodded. Yes. Min frowned slightly. What does that mean in practical terms? Lan answered carefully. It means they are beginning to distinguish between your presence and your assumed consent. Silence followed. That distinction mattered more than anything else so far, because it removed the illusion of permanence. Tuan looked at me again, this time quieter. You really built all of this into a system no one else understood, he said. I met his gaze.
I didn't build it, I corrected. A pause.
I maintained it because no one else ever asked what it was costing to keep it stable. Silence followed again. The wristwatch remained unchanged. 3:17. Still frozen, still outside the flow of everything else. Min finally spoke again. If everything is being re-evaluated like this, he said slowly, what happens to us personally? I looked at him for a long moment, not as a father, not as authority, but as someone watching the final stage of realization begin to form. Personally, I said quietly, you begin to separate your identity from what was being stabilized for you. A pause. And you discover what remains when that stabilization is no longer silently maintained. Silence. No interruptions, no corrections, no resistance. Only understanding forming too late to reverse what had already begun. I stood up slowly. This time no one reacted, not because they were calm, but because reaction itself no longer felt like it could influence outcome. I picked up the wristwatch, 3:17, still unchanged. I turned it slightly in my hand, then placed it back on the table. And as I did, I spoke the final line of that moment quietly. You are not watching collapse, I said. A pause. You are watching reality continue without compensation. And for the first time since this began, no one in the room asked me to explain further, because they finally understood that explanation was no longer something I was responsible for providing. Only consequence was. By the 5th day, the house stopped reacting quickly. That was the clearest sign something irreversible had taken hold. Min no longer answered every call immediately. Tuan no longer rushed to interpret every message. Even Lan had begun to pause before checking updates, as if each new piece of information required emotional cost accounting before acceptance. I noticed these changes without comment. That was important, because acknowledgement would have turned observation back into participation. The wristwatch remained on the table. 3:17. Still unchanged, not because time had stopped, but because nothing in this house had been allowed to move forward with clarity long enough for it to matter. Min finally spoke mid-morning, standing near the window. They've started consolidating all family-linked accounts under review status, he said. His voice was flatter now, less resistance, more exhaustion. I nodded once. Yes. Tuan looked at him. Does that mean frozen? He asked. Min hesitated, then answered. It means no one is willing to assume responsibility for them right now. Silence followed. That sentence carried more weight than the technical explanation. Lon stepped into the room quietly. "It's spreading beyond financial systems now," she said. I looked at her. She continued carefully. "Some personal agreements are being paused, pending verification of authority structures." Min exhaled sharply. "So it's everything," he said. I nodded. "Yes." No emphasis, no emotion, just confirmation of scope. Tuan sat down slowly at the edge of the table. For the first time, I saw something closer to fatigue than calculation. "This wasn't supposed to happen like this," he said quietly. I looked at him. "And how was it supposed to happen?" I asked. He hesitated. That hesitation was important, because it revealed assumption rather than plan. "I don't know," he admitted finally. That honesty changed nothing externally, but internally, it marked another shift. Min ran a hand across his face. "This is going to trigger external investigations," he said. I nodded. "Yes." Lon added quietly, "It already has in some departments." Silence followed again. Not dramatic, not emotional, procedural. The kind of silence that appears when systems begin to recognize they are being observed from outside their own assumptions. Min finally turned toward me. "You're still not reacting to any of this," he said. I met his gaze. "I am reacting," I replied calmly. A pause. "By no longer compensating." That sentence no longer provoked resistance. It only registered. Tuan looked at me again. "But why does it feel like everything depended on you more than we realized?" he asked quietly. I paused, not because I was uncertain, because I was choosing how direct the truth needed to be at this stage. "Because it did," I said simply. Silence followed. Lon exhaled slowly. "There's something else," she said again. All attention shifted toward her. She looked at Min first, then Tuan, then finally me. "They are starting to separate individual responsibility from historical authorization patterns," she said. Min frowned. "In plain terms?" he asked. Lon answered carefully. "It means they are no longer treating this as a unified family structure in external systems." That landed differently, because unity had been their assumed shield. Tuan spoke quietly. "So what are we now?" he asked. That question hung in the room longer than any other so far. I looked at him for a long moment, not as someone who owed him reassurance, but as someone observing the final stage of dependency becoming visible to itself. "You are individuals inside a system that is no longer being held as one," I said quietly. Silence followed. Min looked down, not defeated, but processing identity without structural support. Lan stepped slightly closer to the table. "The rate of change is increasing," she said quietly. I nodded. "Yes." No surprise, no resistance, only acknowledgement. Min spoke again, but slower now. "What happens when this reaches external confirmation layers?" he asked. I looked at him. "Then the version of reality you are operating under becomes irrelevant," I said calmly. A pause. "And only verified structure remains." Silence followed again. Tuan leaned back slightly in his chair. For the first time, I saw something like acceptance forming. Not emotional acceptance, but cognitive exhaustion reaching its limit. "This feels like it's already decided," he said quietly. I met his gaze. "It was decided long before you noticed it changing," I replied. A pause. "You were just now experiencing the removal of what made it feel negotiable." The room fell quiet again. The wristwatch remained unchanged. 3:17. Still holding its place like a memory refusing to update itself. I stood slowly. No one reacted immediately. Not because they were calm, but because reaction no longer felt like it had authority. I looked at all three of them, and for the first time in days, I spoke not as participant, but as final observer. I did not create instability, I said quietly. A pause. I stopped preventing you from seeing it. And in that moment, for the first time, no one tried to respond, because they finally understood the difference between collapse and exposure was not action. It was absence of intervention. The house began to feel unfamiliar in its own silence, not because anything had changed visibly, but because nothing was being repaired anymore. Small problems accumulated in ways no one addressed. A delayed response here, a missing confirmation there, a call that ended without resolution. It was subtle, almost polite in how it broke down, but it was continuous. That continuity was the real shift. Min noticed it first in the morning routine. He stood in the kitchen longer than usual, staring at the coffee machine as if expecting it to behave differently if observed closely enough. It didn't. Tuan came in shortly after, checking his phone with less urgency and more uncertainty. Lan didn't enter the room immediately. She paused at the threshold, like someone assessing whether stepping in would still change anything. I was already seated. Same chair, same position. The wristwatch still on the table. 3:17. It had become less a time and more a boundary marker between what they thought was stable and what was no longer being held together. Min finally spoke. "Internal reviews are expanding," he said. "Not directed at me, not directed at anyone, just stating the current state of the system." I nodded once. "Yes." Tuan looked up. "They're asking for clarification on historical approvals now," he said. I met his gaze. "Yes," I replied. Silence followed. Lan stepped forward slightly. "This is no longer limited to correction or adjustment," she said quietly. "They are reconstructing the entire authorization timeline." Min exhaled sharply. "So everything is being questioned," he said. I nodded. "Yes." No emphasis. No emotion. Just confirmation. Tuan sat down slowly. "This feels like it's spreading beyond anything we can control," he said quietly. I looked at him. "It already has," I said calmly. A pause. "You are just now experiencing its full surface area." Silence followed again. Not confusion anymore. Measurement. Min rubbed his forehead. "You knew this level of fallout would happen?" he said. I turned slightly toward him. "Yes." That answer no longer created resistance. It only created recognition. Lan spoke again, softer. "There is something structurally important happening now," she said. All eyes turned to her. She hesitated briefly, then continued. "Systems are beginning to separate what was assumed authority from what can be verified." Min frowned. "In simpler terms?" he asked. Lan answered carefully. "It means prior trust is no longer being treated as proof of legitimacy." Silence. That sentence landed heavier than anything technical, because it meant history itself was no longer sufficient justification. Tuan looked at me. "So what remains valid?" he asked quietly. I studied him for a long moment, not as a son, but as someone watching the final stage of dependency transition into understanding. "Only what can function without assumed correction," I said. A pause. "And very little of what you are experiencing was designed for that." Silence followed. Min leaned back slightly. "This is moving too fast," he said. I nodded. "Yes." No disagreement, no reassurance, just alignment. Lan stepped closer to me. "External pressure is increasing," she said quietly. I nodded again. "Yes." She studied me carefully. "And you are still not intervening." I met her gaze.